Welcome all for coming to Globis. And we are so happy to have Dr. Ian Bremer coming to speak with us. I think he is one of the greatest speakers that Globis ever have received for this kind of seminar. So we are so happy about. I met Ian at Davos in 2004 or 2005. And he was a part of Young Global Leader, and I was part of that young something. And we met together. He looked young, and he was young at the time. And right now, he is probably the most well-respected geopolitical speaker and analyst, and talking about various issues about military, about economy. And he is one of the most celebrated or most visible speaker in Davos as well. So we are so happy, and I'm personally very happy to have Ian coming here to speak. I'd like to briefly introduce Ian. Dr. Ian Bremer is the founder and president of Eurasia Group, the leading global political risk research and consulting firm. The company provides financial, corporate, and government clients with information and insight on how political developments move markets. Created Wall Street's first global political risk index, has authored several best-selling books, including Every Nation for Itself, Winners and Losers in a G0 World. I have read this book, which is quite insightful. And The End of the Free Market, Who Wins the War Between States and Corporations. Ian is a contributor for the Financial Times, A-List, and Reuters.com, and writes the core blog on foreignpolicy.com. Has a PhD in political science from Stanford University in 1994, and his analysis focus on global macro-political trends and emerging markets. Grew up in Boston and now lives in New York and Washington, D.C. So all of us, let's welcome Dr. Ian Bremer.
Okay, am I on? I'm on. Thank you. Nice to see everybody. I have slides. I never use slides. The last time I used slides was about 12 or 13 years ago. So these are old. I'm kidding. I'm not kidding about 12 or 13 years. But Hori-san said good to have slides. So I have them. Maybe I'll use them. I can't tell. I also am not going to talk that long because there are a lot of students here, and also because Hori-san's pretty brilliant. And so we're going to talk a lot. And then I want to talk with you because it's more fun. So I want to talk enough so you know what I'm talking about. And then I want to open it up. That's my idea. So I will start with a slide. That's an easy one. What's the G0? Okay. Has everyone heard of the G0? Hands. Not bad. But you're here, so you're self-selected. The concept of the G0, right? A world order in which no single country or durable alliance of countries can meet the challenges of global leadership. What happens when the G20 doesn't work and the G7 is history? The G7 is history. We had a G7. To be fair, it wasn't really a G7. It was a G1 plus. I can say this at Globus, right? It was a G1 plus. We came out of World War II, and the United States was the only man left standing, right? And helped to rebuild Japan, helped to rebuild Europe, and created global architecture. World Bank, IMF, Bretton Woods on currency, WTO, right? United Nations. These are all big organizations. They sound global. Love it, they sound global. They're not global. They're not global. They're American. With our friends and with our priorities, our values, our capital. I'm not saying this to be arrogant. It's objective, right? You need to understand that the World Bank is an American organization to understand why the emerging markets have a problem with it, particularly why China has a problem with it. So let me give you an example of why I think we have a G0. So last year, Hori-san and I, we met at Davos. And last year, at Davos, there were almost no Chinese. The World Economic Forum also, not a global organization, right? Western organization. Not American, but Western organization. And the folks, the Chinese that showed up last year, the few, we asked them, where are the Chinese? Where are they? Because there you got 1.3 billion of them, so you wouldn't miss a few if they came, right? I mean, you send some. And they said, well, you know, you hosted Davos during the Chinese New Year. So, you know, that's not respectful. We're not going to come. You got to change it. And so Klaus Schwab says, okay, we'll move it. We're going to move it up a week. So next year, you'll come. So we go this year. Big Japanese delegation. Went very well. No Chinese. Why aren't you here? They're getting ready for Chinese New Year, right? No. The reason they're not there, I asked a couple of the members of the delegation, the small and mid-level delegation, and they said, and I appreciated this, they said, you know, we are sick of joining things. The World Economic Forum, you're all about transparency and good governance, democracy, sustainability, dealing with climate change. You've got this agenda of the advanced industrial democracies. We are not one of them. And you invite us to some panels and then you lecture at us to become like you. We have a summer Davos in Dalian and Tianjin. You're very welcome. Come to that. We have the Bao Forum. Come to that. We want to make the rules. Just like America. America doesn't want to join. This isn't just China. America hates joining things. America wants to make the rules. And now China wants to make the rules. Different rules. America wants multilateral rules that it controls. China wants bilateral rules where it's more powerful. How can this possibly work? G0. G0. There are 4 reasons why we got to G0. Reason number 1, too many countries. Too many countries. Hard to coordinate with 7, impossible to coordinate with 20. Number 2, those new countries are different. They're poor. They have different political and economic priorities. And most importantly, China is an authoritarian system. It's a state capitalist system. And it's the one that matters. China is the one that matters. If it wasn't for China, you would have less of an issue. Is it because I don't like China? No. It's because China's big. The size of the Chinese economy. We talk about the BRICS, right? The BRICS. We should stop. There are no BRICS. China is bigger than Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa, all added together. There are no BRICS. There's China, then there are other emerging markets, right? Third point, America's allies, busy. Very busy. Japan now finally less so. And that's a good thing. Europe, very busy. The Italians are busy. I've been watching the Italians the last couple days, busy Italians. The Greeks are busy, the Spaniards are busy, the Brits are busy, the Germans are busy. We're not getting help there. And the Americans are not so busy, but they're not that interested. I mean, Abe just came to the United States, came to Washington. It was a good trip. It was a good trip. And, you know, we might have a government in Japan that lasts more than a few weeks, so we'll see him again. That would be good. But the United States doesn't care much about Japan. I'm not happy to say this. I care about Japan, but I do foreign policy. Did you see Obama's State of the Union? Anyone? Few people. The inauguration speech. How about the foreign policy debate between Romney and Obama? Anyone see that? Foreign policy debate. I apologize for those of you that saw that. That was not a good debate. There were three things that we learned during the foreign policy debate. Right? Number one, we learned that both Obama and Romney love teachers. We talked about that. They love drones, both of them said. And third, they love not talking about foreign policy. That is the most important thing. If you saw the State of the Union, foreign policy, where was it? Most important thing, getting troops out of places, right? Japan was mentioned as a place that America has lost jobs to and that we're going to get them back. This is not out of disrespect to Japan. This is because Americans don't care about talking about these issues, right? So the Americans could do more, but they don't want to. And that's not changing anytime soon. So if you add up all four of these reasons, you get a G0. Now, this is a business school, so I want to talk about both East Asia, but also business. What does it mean in 2013 for us to have a G0 for business? What does it mean to be Japan in 2013 in the G0? And let me say one more thing before I answer that, which is I want everyone here to know I don't like the G0. The fact that I say it does not mean I like it, right? I'm a political scientist. I'm not paid to say things I like. I was at Davos 2 years ago when I talked about the G0 for the first time, and it got a lot of attention. And Ilse Kong was there. Ilse Kong was, at the time, the Sherpa for the G20 when South Korea was the president of the G20. And he was angry at me. And we got into a big public debate. He said, what do you want? You don't like the G20. You want a G7? You want it to be smaller? You want a G192? You want it to be bigger? I said, it has nothing to do with what I want. I want a pony. It doesn't matter what I want. It's what you have. You have a G0. Right? I mean, we keep having these summits on climate, global summits on climate, right? Copenhagen and Durban and Cancun, Rio +20, they all fail. Every one fails. I had students at Columbia this year, and I asked them, how many more global summits on climate do we need to have fail before we realize we should stop having global climate summits? One of my students raised his hand, and he said 7. That wasn't a bad answer. It's 1 or 2, definitely we need more than that. 10 is probably starting to get a little foolish. 7 sounded okay. But the point was, these don't work for the reasons I mentioned. You cannot have US-led global organizations anymore. They won't work. I gave a speech to the World Bank, and I told them, you aren't global. You have to stop pretending you're global. Maybe change your name. Right? We have the World Series in the US that has a Canadian team. Maybe we should change the name, right? And call it the International Bank. A few countries. We have an International House of Pancakes, US, Canada, Guatemala. You can do that, right? Don't make it global. I told the World Bank, you can't be global. You have a choice. You can pretend you're global, all right, and you will lose power and become ineffective. You will be like the Security Council. If the World Bank wants to invite everyone truly in, it will stop being effective, just like the G20, just like the Security Council. Or you can be smaller. You can be a developed bank, which you have been, and then you can actually get things done. This is not happening on climate. This is happening on trade. TPP. We would love the Doha round. The US wants a Doha round. Not going to happen. Why not? G0. So instead, TPP. What's TPP? TPP, if it works, there it is. If it works, 40% of GDP. That's not 100%. It's not great. It's not bad. It's a start. And then if you get a transatlantic free trade agreement, You get another 25, 30% in there, right? Now, China's not a part of it. Why not? Doesn't agree. In 10 years, 15 years' time, maybe they'll agree. Until that, you'd rather have global. But if you can't do global, you will do coalitions of the willing. That is not ideal. So let me now say, what does that mean for business? What does it mean for business? When I think back to the old G1 plus world, I remember reading Tom Friedman's World is Flat. Who's read that book? Tom Friedman, World is Flat. A lot of Americans have read that book. I think about 2 million Americans, which is an extraordinary number to read about anything outside the US. That's like a good thing. And Tom Friedman, he wrote in the beginning of the book, he was on a plane and he went to Bangalore. He always writes about going on planes to places. And he was on a golf course and he's golfing and he sees on the golf course a billboard. And the billboard is for Pizza Hut. And he goes, wow, I'm not in Kansas anymore because I'm in Bangalore on a golf course and there's a billboard for Pizza Hut. And the world is flat. And the reason the world is flat is because it doesn't matter. If you're in Bangalore or in New York City, I can sell pizza. Flat world, right? And the great thing about Tom Friedman is in the flat world, you don't need me. You don't need political scientists. You don't need to talk about government because multinational corporations just sell everywhere, right? The company that best is an example of the G1 plus of the globalized flat world is a tiny company called Coca-Cola, right? Coca-Cola sells, I think, 194 countries they're in. The most well-known word in the world is okay. That word is more known by more people in the world than any other word. Second most well-known word? Anyone? Guess? Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola. Second most well-known word, right? They sell everywhere. They're not in North Korea. They're in Myanmar now. They sell everywhere, right? And if you are talking about a flat world, a G1 plus world, you want to be like Coke. You want to be just like Coke, right? I was watching Facebook a couple months ago when they got their billionth user, their billionth person on Facebook. And Mark Zuckerberg, God bless him, he's on television, and Maria Bartiromo asks him, what's your goal? And he said, well, you know, there are 7 billion people in the world. I want to connect those 6 billion to my 1 billion. He wants to be like Coke. That's a great idea. One problem. In 2015, there are going to be 800 million internet users in China. There will not be Facebook. Why not? Because the Chinese don't want Facebook. I don't blame them. I don't. They don't want Google. They don't want Twitter. They want Chinese companies. Not only because they'd rather have Chinese companies make the money, but more importantly, you don't want an American company owning that sensitive data over all of these Chinese people. That is an absurdly stupid thing for the Chinese government. If I were advising the Chinese government, I would tell them, no Google, no Facebook, no Twitter. So Mark Zuckerberg thinks he's in a flat world, but he's not. Now, if I think about Tom Friedman's flat world, there was another model. There's the Coca-Cola model, but there was another model. The other model is a company called Lockheed Martin. Have you heard of the term too big to fail? So, Too Big to Fail, right? Big book by Andrew Ross Sorkin talking about American banks that are so big you can't let them fail, you have to bail them out. The first time this book was used, I asked Sorkin about it. He didn't know. He actually didn't know. The first time Too Big to Fail was ever used was not to describe a bank. It was in the 70s to describe Lockheed. Not about banking. 95% of Lockheed's employees are in America. This is the military company, right? The defense company. 80% of their sales to the Pentagon. 20% of the other sales, not to China, not to North Korea, but to allies of the United States. So here you have a flat world, a G1 plus world. Everyone wants to be like Coca-Cola. You don't need governments, you don't need political scientists. But Lockheed Martin, you might as well not pay attention to markets. All you need are governments. You are Mr. Political. But very few companies want to be like Lockheed. Everyone wants to be like Coke. Here is the point. In a G0 world, most companies still think they want to be like Coke, but they can't be. There is a spectrum between Coke and Lockheed. And every company out there needs to understand where they are. Nissan thought they were like Coke. And then you had some anti-Japanese demonstrations. Turned out, Nissan not so like Coke, right? I remember these Volkswagen dealerships that had the banners in front in China, and they said that they supported the Chinese position on the contested territories. I didn't know Volkswagen had a position on the contested territories. It's in their GPS or something like that, right? This is a problem for Japan. It's not just a problem for Japan. It's a problem for any corporation in a strategic sector, any corporation trying to compete with state-owned enterprises that are powerful. Soon, China will be the largest economy in the world. The largest economy in the world. And the most important economic actor in China will be the state. It will not be private sector when that happens. That is a very different planet than Tom Friedman wrote about. When Tom Friedman wrote that book, he was largely right. If he wrote that book today, he would be largely wrong. Political scientists are relevant now for these companies. Again, not something we should be happy about. It's not a good thing. It's a challenging thing. So that's what it means for business. What does it mean for East Asia? So in a G0 world, there are really three things that are happening that matter. Three big things. China is rising, the Middle East is exploding, and Europe is muddling through. And in that context, there are three countries that have real challenges. They are all countries that in a G1 world had to worry much less because they were key strategic allies of the US. Who am I talking about? Japan, Israel, and Britain. What I call the JIBs, right? Not a club you want to be a member of. China's rise is a mixed blessing, but it is largely a problem for Japan. The Middle East exploding is not a mixed blessing. It is largely a problem, but it is a bigger problem for Israel than anyone else. And Europe muddling through is a bigger problem for Britain than anyone else. America's three strategic allies have to figure out how to cope with a G0 world. It would be ideal if we could move towards a G2. If the US and China were to start working together strategically, that is much better for Japan. Japan wants to be in a position where it can benefit from cooperation between the world's two largest economies. I would not bet on that. The US and China are not moving closer together. They are moving farther apart. That is a problem for Japan. The G0 environment is one where the Japanese must hedge much more effectively. They have to be in many other countries. They have to be concerned about what happens if the China relationship gets much worse. Now, I am not suggesting nationalism for Japan. Abe-san has done many things right, as is evidenced by his 70% approval rating. One thing I would not suggest is 267 additional Japanese soldiers. The symbolism of more Japanese military does not help Japan. It provokes the Chinese. I personally think that the meeting between Noda-san and Hu Jintao on September 9th, where he said nothing about the intention to buy these islands, and then on September 11th, he buys these islands, probably not the way I would have handled that. More sensitivity to a country that is larger and can hurt you. The United States is Japan's ally. The U.S. will stick with Japan. But the priority for the U.S. is not the East China Sea. It is cybersecurity on the China relationship. And the Americans really don't want to think that the Japanese are going to be like President Saakashvili and Georgia, provoking the Russians. They do not want that. Those countries are not the same, I understand. Japan's much more important. Georgia was not. The U.S. can ignore Georgia. They can't ignore Japan. There are lots of mutual interests here. But it is nonetheless apocryphal. It is worth a reminder. So I do believe that for Japan in particular, understanding the implications of the G0, understanding the implications of the JIBs are important so we can get out of it soon. I would be happier if the G0 would be over soon. So final point, what comes next? What comes next? How long does this last? I don't know. But I can give you a way to think about it. I think if you want to understand what comes after the G0, there are really two questions you need to answer. The first is, what is the nature of the relationship between the U.S. and China? Is it relatively harmonious or relatively conflictual? And then secondly, how important are other countries? Are they relatively important or are they relatively unimportant? And if you can answer those two questions, you will have a good sense of what is likely to come next. So far, if the G0 was born in 2008 with the financial crisis, I would argue the U.S.-China relationship is getting worse. Other countries are likely to matter a lot, in part because they're becoming more important, in part because the U.S. and China both do not want to play the role of global leader. If that is true, the G0 will not be replaced by the G anything. It'll be replaced by smaller, regional, and thematic alliances, different types of integration, some of which will be about politics and economics, some will be about security, some will be about energy, some will be sectarian. That's good for some parts of the world. That's a challenge for Asia. And it's a challenge for Asia because in Asia, China is doing most of the economic integration, while the U.S. is doing most of the political and strategic integration. And countries will want to balance between those two things. But the longer this persists, the harder it will be for many countries to balance. The greater the necessity of choice. Japan does not want to be in a position where it needs to make a choice. it will be hard for Japan to avoid that. It'll be easier for Indonesia. It'll be easier for Singapore. It'll be hard for Vietnam on the other side, just like it's hard for Cambodia or Laos. That's kind of where I see us heading. So that's a few minutes from me on what I was asked to talk about: G0, business implications, Asia implications. Now I think we'll have a fairly lively conversation between me and Hori-san, and then hopefully all of you guys will not be shy and you will tell me whatever you think. So please.
Thank you, Mr. Bremer.
And I always enjoy having conversation. We had the last conversation on Monday, and at the same time we had one in Davos. And I'd like to ask some questions. At the same time, I'd like to make some opinion as well, because I think you like that as well. First of all, I'd like to ask you about what is your judgment of the Abe-Obama meetings right now that they had last week?
Look, it was a great meeting. There's no question that, first of all, the most important topic between Obama and Abe privately was China. The most important topic between Obama and Abe publicly was not China. And that is because the Obama administration does not want to provoke China unnecessarily. But it was very clear the level of coordination on TPP was high. Obama feels good about that. He wants to get it done. He sees the commitment from Abe-san. The level of coordination on the security relationship is high. And the importance of Japan to the U.S. is going up. So I think it was very important that these two leaders got together. It's unusual when the Japanese and the Americans are meeting, when it turns out that you have a Japanese leader who is more forceful and open than the American leader. But that is what we have right now. Obama is a relatively closed personality. He holds his cards very close to his chest. And he certainly is not someone who is prioritizing, as we mentioned, foreign policy. But it's pretty clear that Obama's interested in using this relationship as part of the pivot to the region, as part of economic statecraft. I will say, Secretary of State Kerry, no experience in Japan. Very little in Asia. It's not his priority. You know, the big players in the U.S., you had the A-team, you had Geithner, you had Hillary, you had Gates, you had Petraeus. We've got the B-team now, right? The new, these aren't bad guys, but they're not what we had. And that's going to be harder for Asia than what you had the first 4 years.
Can you guess what was the informal discussion that they had on China?
Sure.
Do you know, or can you share if you know a little bit?
I know a little bit, but look, it's very clear. The United States was providing a lot of affirmation about the willingness of the U.S. to support Japan in the incidence of further incursions by the Chinese into the East China Sea. As you know, we've increased the military deployments in the area. We've got AWACS flying in the area. The Chinese don't like that. Hillary Clinton was making consistent statements about the importance of recognizing the Japanese alliance terms as tantamount, though we don't take a position on the islands. That is, again, that's supporting Japan. That was a big part. The other big part, as I mentioned, cybersecurity. It used to be that the Americans have always known that China is the biggest cybersecurity problem out there, but they couldn't prove it. Now they can prove it. They actually have the technology to track the attacks back to the Chinese government, the Chinese military. The Chinese response has been, we don't do that. Not helpful. Now, to be fair, the Americans do it too, but the Americans attack the Chinese government to government, and the Americans are winning. The Chinese attack the U.S. government to company because the U.S. does not engage in attacks on behalf of IBM. It's not the American system. It doesn't work that way. The Chinese system does work that way, and the American companies are increasingly getting public about it. This is a huge problem. And absolutely there was a lot of talk between the Americans and the Japanese about how to jointly address that.
I think we are getting more and more information and news about China attacks on Europe as well, like European companies as well as American companies.
Yep.
So it will become a major issue which we will confront in the future. In terms of like Abe and Obama meetings, I think Abe-san was very smart in a way to craft the meeting to tackle Japanese domestic issues. 3 domestic issues. One is about TPP. TPP could be a global issue, but it's more domestic issue, as you know. Second is about nuclear issue. He said that there will be, like a 2025 zero nuclear is gone. It was done by Democratic Party of Japan, but it's not the LDP position. So he said that in public in the U.S., which is a very good way to tackle Japanese domestic issues. Third domestic issue was Okinawa. He talked. Mr. Abe went to Okinawa before the trip to the U.S., and then he talked about the Okinawa of Tenma and also some Hekono-based issues. And so I think he did a very good job in trying to tackle domestic issues in relationship to Japan, the U.S. relationship, which is the only ally for Japan. So I thought that
And gas as well.
And the gas as well.
Also important.
But in case of gas, but I heard that as you mentioned, that we will not be able to import as much gas as we could expect that.
Well, first of all, the Obama administration is going to focus domestically first and foremost with the unconventional gas explosion. Sure. As the U.S. produces more, prices are coming down. That helps Japan. But there will be new projects approved in the coming years, and those projects will bring more gas to Japan. And clearly, part of the importance of TPP as a free trade agreement will be to allow the export of gas to Japan. So I think that is moving.
Sure, but I didn't include that as 3 major domestic issues because we did not talk about that, and the gas import is not divided. In terms of Okinawa, it's totally divided.
Yep.
TPP is totally divided.
That's true.
And nuclear issue is totally divided.
Yep.
And so Abe-san was quite smart in crafting the meetings to be able to tackle domestic issues. Let's go on to China. And I said to this before, and you disagreed, which is in case of China, I think China is losing diplomacy globally,
right. Yeah.
and China is losing in terms of public relations. In terms of diplomacy, China is alienating Southeast Asian nations, Myanmar, and I heard some of the leader of Africa calling China as, pest or something, like a very bad word. No, it was used in, it was quoted in some of the news. And so some of the African leader is being somehow offended by the China's aggression into Africa nation. In terms of public relations, when we met at Davos, and whenever China is coming out in the discussion, it's more about pollution or like a southern weekend, or corruption, and so it's not a good news about China.
Well, China.
So what do you think about that?
Well, you're right. I disagree, and I don't completely disagree. I mean, look. First of all, it's very clear. You're right. China is not popular at Davos. Davos is not meant for China. And we need to understand that. But China's not trying to win popularity contests. America wants to be liked. It wants to be powerful and liked. And it's disappointing. It's like, how come you don't like us? We're doing all these good things. I mean, yeah, we killed some people with drones, but mostly the bad guys. You should like us. We get upset when we're not liked. And I am very much an American in that regard. I hate it when people don't like me. It's a horrible American trait. I can't deal with it. The Chinese don't actually care. The Chinese want to be listened to. They want to be respected. They want people to react the way they want them to react. You don't like them, that's fine. As long as you do what you say you're going to do, we don't really care if you don't like us. And so my response, play the tape, is where is China succeeding? Not in being liked. Where is China succeeding in having more influence around the world? And I count about half of the world population. First, China's impressing the Chinese. It's not a small thing. 1.3 billion Chinese, most of whom are pretty impressed with what China's doing. They're pretty pleased with what China's doing. Not all of them, but most of them. Then we've got Africa. You're right, there are a lot of Africans that think the Chinese are getting a little bit annoying. You know, they're a little bumptious. But you know what? The Chinese write checks. They write big checks. And in return, they say, here's what we want. I was with the Nigerian Minister of Trade at Davos, and I asked him, so what countries are doing the most effectively with you in terms of trade? He only said one. Immediately he said, China. Why? He said, they're paying everything. They're coming in, they're building the place. Across Africa, that is true. The Chinese are winning Africa. Doesn't mean that other countries don't matter, but the Chinese influence is much greater than anyone else's. Now, there are many in Southeast Asia that are very upset with what China's doing. But China's economic influence in Southeast Asia is growing radically. Look, the Taiwanese have been very upset with China for a long time. But you know what? There are 1 million Taiwanese now living in mainland China. And the KMT is now in place. And today, the chairman of the KMT was up in Beijing talking about his pals, the mainland Chinese. India. The Indians have big security problems with the Chinese, but I know 1.1 billion Indians that also think, right, that the Chinese economically are doing good business with India. There's a lot of, any businessman in India you talk to says, yeah, we're making great money in China. Manufacturing's coming over to India. The Indians are giving entrepreneurship to China. That works better than the Indian-US economic relationship right now. You've got Russia, where Russia's clearly closer to China today than the restart with the United States. And also, by the way, the special relationship between Merkel and the Chinese economically, which is limited in what it can do because the values are very different, but in terms of the general trend has been quite favorable for China. So, yeah, you go to Davos, nobody likes China. But you go around the world, and for a country that is still number 2 and is poor and does not have an ideology that appeals to anyone, doesn't really have an ideology, it just has quid pro quo, right? It's actually doing okay.
Like the more, I have quite a few Chinese friends, and the more I talk to them, the more they are frustrated with Chinese government. That's what I'm hearing. And after you hear about the corruption that the leader of the Communist Party is getting about multi-billion-dollar money, and that news is all spreading out, and then they get so frustrated about what's happening. And you mentioned about most of the Chinese people are happy about what's happening. I'm skeptical about that. Some of the people who are well informed tend to be more and more frustrated about things, but they know that they cannot do lots of things to change that, so they are being more quiet. That's what I feel sensing what's happening. In terms of India,
we should address that, though.
Yeah. In terms of India, Abe-san is very good friends with India because of his past relationship with his family or grandfather as well. And his way of thinking about the world is not bilateral. You mentioned about China is being bilateral, but in case of Abe-san is thinking more as a globe. And first he visited Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia, and then the US, and then he will probably go to India, or India's prime minister is coming as well, and South Korea, and he'll think more on a global basis, and then to Russia. And Mr. Abe's position is quite clear that the door is open to have dialogue with China, and that's the position of Mr. Abe, and that's a very strategic thinking that he is coming up with. And in terms of the foreign policy, I think it's important to have the friends. And it's important not to make enemies. In that sense, I think how things are going, in terms of China, I'm not really sure whether they are succeeding or not.
Well, so I think it's very possible that there are many in India that will end up liking Abe more than they like the Chinese. And yet, India will do vastly more business with China than they do with Japan. When I go to India, no one talks about Japan. Japan's not even on the map. Now, that will change somewhat with Abe. Yeah. It will, somewhat. But let's face it, Africa, you got over 1 million Chinese living in Africa. You know how many Japanese live in Africa? 8,000. The Japanese are nowhere in Africa. And again, I don't say this to criticize at all. We got to speak reality. The Chinese, absolutely, there are wealthy Chinese that are upset and frustrated with the Chinese government. And, if you're worth $1 billion in China, you still can't buy clean air in Beijing. You can't buy product safety off the shelves. You can't buy a safe high-speed rail ticket. That's frustrating. And over 50% of Chinese millionaires that did in a poll that was taken recently said that they would rather live in the United States than China. That's interesting, right? But most Chinese aren't worth over $1 million. And China, for the last 35 years, has grown on average 10% every year. The average Chinese likes the Chinese government a lot more than they like Japan, a lot more than they like the US. They trust the Chinese government more than they trust Japan. And in part, that's because the Chinese government controls the media. And yeah, there's freedom of information, but you also have a few 100,000 Chinese in the military and the government that are on the internet, that are writing things that are patriotic and support the Chinese perspective. We should not underestimate how proud the Chinese are of what they have accomplished in 35 years. I absolutely disagree with the notion that anywhere close to a majority of the Chinese people have a serious problem with the Chinese government. I think that is wrong.
Okay, let's go on to Korea and North Korea. We had a new inauguration of a new president, Park Geun-hye.
Yep.
And what do you think is going to happen to South Korean policy? And is it going to be any changes happening, or what do you think is going to happen?
I think that on the one hand, South Korea is doing very well economically. It's very developed. The companies have great technology. But they live next to North Korea. It's not a happy place to be. Who wants to live next to North Korea? We don't know what Kim Jong-un is going to do. We do know that he's not a friend of China's much anymore. He's doing things the Chinese clearly don't like. It's dangerous. The testing of weapons has stepped up again. How long can he stay in power? If he goes, South Korea has a very serious problem immediately, and they're ignoring it. The Israelis always say that Iran is an existential threat. The Israelis have 200 nuclear weapons. Iran is not an existential threat. The South Koreans don't say North Korea is an existential threat. It is. That should worry us. There's also this interesting dynamic between the younger South Korean generation and the older. Many among the youth in South Korea believe that China is the answer. And I think if it weren't for North Korea, South Korea would be tilting much harder towards China. Because of North Korea, it's very hard for them to do that. The military relationship with the U.S. is much more important. But I do think that it's going to be a challenge. And I think that one of the opportunities for Japan is to improve that relationship. I think that's something Abe can make some moves on it. I think he can make moves on India, too. There are definitely countries out there where the Japanese can make inroads. Myanmar as well. But South Korea is good. There's only so much you can do with South Korea.
I predict that Japan-Korea relationship will become dramatically better.
I think it's quite possible. Yeah.
And the reason behind is that Abe-san has a tendency to think that his grandfather's friends are his friends. And he has like a strong, somehow like a family tie attached to himself. And in case of like President Park Geun-hye's father, he and Abe-san's grandfather was close allies, close friends. And therefore, I think that therefore they cherish that relationship better. And however, Mr. Abe will be quite assertive in terms of Takeshima issues, and that is his strong position about that. But he will not so much touch on Kono talks as much. But I guess that Park Geun-hye president will take it for granted that Mr. Abe will do that. I think the relationship will become better. I think that's quite important for Japan.
Yep.
In terms of India, I think Abe-san will be quite good about. What about North Korea? What's happening there?
I have no idea. I mean, nobody else does. I know. I mean, seriously, we don't know. We don't know, and we should not presume just because Kim Jong-un has been there for a year, and so far we've not seen any problems with the military. We should not presume that's going to work. This is the most totalitarian state in the world, in a society that requires the control of information to keep its people literally in the dark, in a world where your ability to control information is eroding by the hour. We should not presume they will be able to maintain that control. And, this is a country where if you lose control, there's a good chance that if you don't escape, you're going to die, right? If you don't get out of the country, you're probably done. And there aren't many people out there that will welcome the North Koreans. Maybe not even the Chinese in that situation. And in that regard, the potential, I'm not saying I think that we're going to have conflagration, but clearly the fact that North Korea has amassed a substantial nuclear arsenal should be very discomforting to us. The fact that they were trying to export that capacity to Syria should be very worrisome to us. And the Americans said, you can't have nuclear weapons. Okay, didn't work very well. Iran now is working hard to keep their end of the bargain. The Iranians understand very clearly North Korea has nukes. Gaddafi didn't have nukes. Gaddafi's dead. If Gaddafi had nukes, he probably wouldn't be dead. I think that Khamenei understands this. I don't think he's stupid. And this is clearly a very destabilizing trend in the world. Now, this is not a G0 issue, because we had this problem well before the G0. But the G0 makes it worse. It does make it worse.
I understand that you had close relationship with Abe-san yourself. What would you advise to Prime Minister Abe? In lots of situations like a G0 as well as North Korea, and Korea, China, and so forth.
I would not pretend to advise him on what to do in Japan as a non-Japanese.
Okay.
But internationally,
okay.
I would say that it is very important. We have a phrase in English that success is the best revenge. The best way to keep the China relationship in check is to succeed economically, domestically and internationally. I think that the relationship that needs to be emulated by Japan with the U.S. is the Canadian relationship. The Canadians and the U.S. right now are coordinating very well vis-a-vis China, not militarily, but on investment policy. And the Americans are very arrogant about Canada. They think that it's the 51st state. They think that Canadian energy belongs to the U.S. The Canadians, right, actually are working closely with the U.S. China wants to go in and buy everything. Canada knows this is a problem, and Canada's saying, okay, let's make sure we have the same investment policy. Let's make sure we understand what is and what isn't strategic. How should we think about contracts? How should we think about percentages of what's allowed? What kind of national security policy for investment should we have? Japan is much better at this than the U.S. and Canada. Right? The U.S., we've got a Department of Commerce, it's weak. Our good ministries, our State Department, CIA, NSA, that's not Japan. Your good ministry is METI. That's the one ministry that is set up to do industrial policy. The Japanese should be telling the Americans, we want to work with you in Canada to be a part of this. I would tell Abe, so that's where you want to work. And that could be good. That could be really promising. And that will be less provocative to the Chinese than building your military, changing your constitution, God forbid, talking about nuclear weapons, which I don't think anyone's serious about, but God forbid, right? That's not doing anybody any favors. That's my view.
You mentioned about not provoke China
Yeah.
a lot, but whatever you do, that might offend China. In terms of let's say like there are some ships coming into the
Yep.
water already
Yep.
right now,
Yep.
and then we want them to leave the territory, the
Yep.
water,
Right.
and that might offend Chinese policy as well. So whatever you do,
Yeah.
that might provoke China.
Look, this is hard.
Yeah, sure.
Let me be clear. What I mean is, do not provoke China unnecessarily. Only provoke China necessarily, right? And there will be occasions where you need to provoke them necessarily. But let me give you an example. Hillary Clinton, I loved it when Hillary Clinton said, you really shouldn't criticize your banker, right? And she was talking about human rights. And America doesn't talk about human rights with China the way they used to. We used to bring it up all the time. You need to, you need to, you need to. We still care about human rights. We're not as credible because of Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, but we still do care. And let's be clear, America's human rights record is not in the same league as China's, right? Even with all of these horrible things that the U.S. has to account for, we actually do this pretty well compared to China. We could lecture the Chinese. It's not going to help. We could talk about the Dalai Lama all the time. We don't do it the way we used to. We could talk about the Uyghurs. We don't do it the way we used to. We try not to unnecessarily provoke the Chinese. The Germans are better at this. The Brits keep doing it. Hu Jintao went to London and said, you're irrelevant. I'm going to spend more time in Germany. We can't afford to do that. The Japanese have to pick their fights very carefully. That's why I mentioned that I thought the way Noda-san handled the islands issue could have been done better. I believe that. And I would say, yeah, you've got to respond. When the Chinese go into your territorial, you've got to respond. But I don't know that you need to expand your military by some marginal percentage to say, look, we're expanding our military. I don't think that helps anything.
Okay, so let's open up to the floor, and I'm sure there are lots of people want to say something. Okay, let's start with Tamura-san.
Thank you. It's always nice to have you here.
Thank you, Tamura-san.
And Hori-san, you did a great job. I really enjoyed. And I have 100 questions, but let's pick 3.
3.
Yeah, quick one.
You're killing me. Okay.
Okay. One is about unnecessary provoking. So you told us that increasing the military personnel will be provoking China. But this afternoon I had a discussion with the ruling party lawmakers that we have to amend the self-defense law to send the troops in order to secure our asset abroad in the wake of the Algeria terrorist attack. So do you think this amendment may provoke China? That's my first question. The second question about the real American intention to disclose the intelligence that Chinese are doing cyber attack from Shanghai. So what is the real intention of the U.S. to disclose this information at this moment? So sending message to whom and what kind of message? The last one is about you recently wrote about the China's People's Daily of China is mentioning a lot about Mao Zedong, and it may be the good sign of positive reform will be happening. So can you touch upon this? Sorry to ask you a lot.
Yeah. Well, the second question is the easiest one. on why the U.S. decided to talk about this. And the answer is because they had no choice. This was not originally disclosed by the U.S. government, this cyber attacks. It was disclosed by an American, bless you, an American security firm called Mendiant, M-E-N-D-I-A-N-T, that has been tracking, a private sector company, all of these attacks. They released the report. The Americans had to respond. Obama did not want this to happen. If you looked at the State of the Union, Obama talked about cyber. He didn't mention China. This was just a week and a half before. So the timing was not good from the Obama perspective. But once the report came out, they had no, and they knew in advance the report was coming, but they didn't know weeks in advance. Then they had to put something together quickly, which they did, and the report was good. But that's where we are. They're trying to be careful. So that's an easy one. The other two are harder. The point on Mao, I would not say that the fact that the Chinese government is propagandizing Mao is necessarily a sign of reform. What I would say is it is possible that just like Nixon was the only one to go to China, it is possible that by taking a much stronger view on Chinese propaganda, it will be easier down the road. If Xi Jinping wants to engage in more reform, he is cloaking himself in hardline Chinese propaganda that might make it easier for him to engage in tougher economic reforms. I don't believe we're talking about political reform, but I think we are talking about maybe some economic experiments that might go farther than what we've seen so far. Banking, right? In particular, tougher regulation on SOEs. That's making them more efficient, that kind of thing. Okay, the tough question you asked me is how might I think about an amendment for the Japanese that would be, the purpose of which would be to defend expats in Algeria? And the answer is I'd be very sensitive to that. Of course the Japanese need to be able to defend their expats. What I'm saying, I was talking first about when you announced the additional 267 soldiers, next to that was they're going to be sent to beef up defense of the islands. I would not have done that. Just, advice is free. That's what it's worth. I wouldn't have done it. On the Algeria situation, if that requires, I'm not inside the issue, but if that requires a change, an amendment to the Constitution on self-defense forces, then you do it, but you make it very clear. You telegraph why you're doing it. You tell the Chinese in advance. You explain it, right? And you make sure that you are consistent in every public statement you make, that this is not oriented at China. The Japanese are not going to win the security game with China. That requires the U.S. And I would just be very, very careful. I know it's no fun. I would hate to be in Japan's position on this. It is very hard for me as an American to sit here in front of you and tell you guys this, given what you've lived through historically and what you're in front of now. But I'm giving you just, as a political scientist, not as an American, as a political scientist, this worries me. You've seen too many times the Chinese are no longer a status quo power. The Chinese are a revisionist power. They increasingly, when they say they don't want to join, they want to create rules, they are not happy with the way the international rules of the road are being formulated. They intend to change them. That will affect Japan more than any other major economy in the world. It behooves Japan not to do things that will allow the Chinese to make your life harder. That is my advice.
Well, let me ask one question. Let's say about 4 or 5 years ago, the U.S. did not have to worry about provoking or not provoking China.
Yeah.
No, they could do whatever they wanted. But nowadays, I hear lots of talk from you that President Obama is so worried not to provoke China. It sounds like it's weakening. The U.S. position is weakening. Why do you have to worry about that so much?
I accept that question. I think it's a good question. As I said, it's a question of not provoking unnecessarily. The cyber fight is a real fight. And, the state capitalism fight is a real fight. I think there are three issues where the U.S. really has to get in China's face. Number one is indigenous innovation, which is not indigenous and it's not innovating, right? It's basically using market access as a club to grab technology and claw their way up the value chain. I understand why they're doing it, and they will keep doing it unless the Americans respond effectively. Now, the problem is that American companies are very short-term in their orientation, and they don't talk to their competitors. And so, remember, when Google was attacked by China, the response of Yahoo was, we don't have any problems with China. When Boeing had their stuff ripped off, GE said, we'll do a deal with you for engines. This is not useful. And the Americans need to have a much tougher perspective on coordinating with American CEOs in areas where otherwise the U.S. will lose competitive advantage long-term strategic industries. And that's hard to do, especially because Obama is not liked by CEOs, right? He does, oh yeah. I mean, CEOs across the board dislike Obama. None of them voted for him. They didn't give money to him. They gave money to congressmen because they want to own their congressmen. But Obama is generally not liked by the CEOs. That's true. Look, he's taxing them, right? They don't like that. I mean, because they're rich individually, right? So it's not like Japan. I mean, the U.S. CEOs make a ton of money, and Obama's been talking against them. So I think that is that's a reason. Problem.
I think what Tamura-san has mentioned is that Japan wants to become just an ordinary country where we can protect our people overseas. And so therefore, I think all of us think that this is a good way and that we should change that, and so that we can protect our people. And that's important so that we can send out our plane to evacuate them out of the overseas, some conflicted areas.
So the three places, I'm sorry, indigenous innovation, cybersecurity, and East and South China Sea. Those are the three areas where I think the United States needs to, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but really needs to have a harder line on China in a public way. And if they do that effectively, Japan will not have to on the security side, which is important because Japan can't do this well. To coordinate, yes. On other issues, the United States has to hold its tongue. Let me give you another example, small example. The U.S. sent a friend of mine, Mike McFaul, as ambassador to Moscow. He's a former Stanford professor, that's how I know. He's a pro-democracy guy, right? He's a hugely pro-opposition on the internet, offending the hell out of the Russians. And the US did that because we don't care. We're prepared to offend the Russians because we're in favor of human rights and fine. Russians don't matter if we piss them off. We would never do that with the ambassador, US ambassador to China. We would not do that. Why? Because China's too important. We have to hold our tongue on places that aren't critical to the US so that we don't screw up the relationship more than it's already being screwed up. And the Japanese need to do the same thing.
Let me point out one thing, that the reason why Abe-san was elected, he had no chances at all before, let's say, before Senkaku issue, let's say like in September, he had no chances to be elected as the leader of LDP. And the reason why he had been elected and the reason why he had been so much supported is because of his stance internationally, his strong position towards China, towards other countries, in protecting the territory, in protecting the people. And that has been supported by Japan. And so that's the DNA of Abe-san.
But we have a great tradition in the United States that when you run for office, you say one thing, and when you're in office, you say something completely different. And I'm hoping the Japanese can embrace that great tradition. I think that is an important tradition.
Abe-san is very pragmatic in that way.
Yes.
And then most of the Japanese people understand that. However, we feel that we have to be stronger. We have to be stronger economically, we have to be stronger military, we have to be stronger in terms of foreign affairs and foreign diplomacy. And that's what we are feeling, so that that's why we need a strong leader. Okay, why don't we have some other points from other people? Yes.
Thank you very much for very insightful speech.
Thank you.
My name is Kiyoshi Fuju, working at some energy company. My question is very simple. How to double U.S. exports by?
Well, the U.S. is going to export more slowly than Japan would like. And because they want to see the impact on price. There was a study that came out recently by NERA, N-E-R-A. It was very, very optimistic, talking about, oh, do whatever you want, the price will be fine. Nobody believed it. And there was, right now there's a comment period, there's over 400 comments, and then there's a review. It's clearly going to be balanced. Like, you're in an energy company, you've seen it, I'm sure. What will happen is they'll approve these 2 or 3 additional projects in the next year or so. They said by summer, but it'll be later than that. And then they're going to watch for a couple years. That gets you to 2016, 2017, right? Now, if a Republican president comes in January 2017, life will change because they'll just say, up, free market, let everybody do what they want. They'll be pro-U.S. energy companies. But again, the oil CEOs, the gas CEOs, they don't like Obama. Obama's not going to do them any favors on this issue. So I think, certainly over the next 4 years, there will be a lot of production coming out of the U.S., but not as much energy export. They're going to take a wait and see. It's going to be cautious. There is a manufacturing move back to the U.S. It's happening. But it's not an overwhelming thing. It's not a renaissance of U.S. jobs. And look at unemployment levels. They're still high in the U.S. Exports will pick up. They will not, I don't think they'll double. But as you said, that was a campaign promise. You say stuff. I mean, if I was running for office, I'd promise you guys all sorts of stuff, right? I mean, I think that's okay. We're used to that. Nobody believes this stuff. Right, it's okay.
Okay, let's have
Thank you
other
very
questions
much.
from maybe one. Anybody from female, like or non-Japanese? Like, let's have one.
Thank you for the inspiring speech. I'm Ken Asanuma from a financial institution. I would like to understand your way of thinking to tackle issues. So from where you start with, how do you aggregate the information, how do you analyze it, and how do you make a conclusion? If you could share the way of your thinking, it would be very helpful.
Well, that's a good question. Your secret.
Methodology. When I used to be a professor back in '94. And I studied the former Soviet Union. The reason my company is called Eurasia Group is because when I started it, that was the part of the world I knew. And that's all I knew. I didn't know anything else. Back then, there was a time, probably in '94, I might have been the best expert, second best expert in the US on Kazakhstan. I mean, who cares? But but I say this to explain. I lived in Kazakhstan for a year. I spoke Russian fluently. I still speak okay. I knew everybody on the ground. I could have told you who the best local experts in Kazakhstan were back then. And I could train them and hire them if I needed to. Now, I can't do that anymore because the last time I was in Kazakhstan was like 4 years ago. But my top Kazakh expert at Eurasia Group does that. And when I started the company, my idea was if I want to cover the world, I need to be able to hire people that can do for the rest of the world what I was doing for Kazakhstan. So Western educated, right, so that they are properly trained. Japan, US, Europe, Singapore, but Western educated, highest level. But they've lived in the country, so they really know it. They travel there frequently. They speak the language. They know the people on the ground. And then they train these people. They find good locals, they hire them, they train them. Furthermore, I've developed a comparative analytics group so that the work that you are doing in different countries around the world has a context, a methodology, so everyone has the same baseline. They kind of know what you're trying to do. So if you have an Indonesia person that has more of a security background, But you have a Russia person that's more of a parliamentary and analyst, they're not going to just focus on their narrow expertise. You need to be able to do macro level country before you go in. And that's the way we start. We have now, I've grown the company organically over 15 years. We have 150 employees full-time. We have 500 locals in 80 countries. We're not huge, but we have enough people to cover the world. And you know, I'm not someone who believes that you can just do quantitative analysis, right? Economists don't do quantitative analysis. They have data, but then they have to make judgments on the veracity of that data, how to weight that data. Political scientists have to do the same thing. This is hard. I also do not believe in crystal ball gazing, right? I think that what we do is not really predict the future. I think what we really do is try to understand what's happening right now. And if you have really good analysis on what's happening right now, you can have a better sense of how bounded the political constraints are. So you might not be able to predict the outcome tomorrow, but you can say that these things can't happen. Only these things can happen because you know where you are today. And that's kind of the way we do our analysis. There's no secret. But I will tell you, when I was a professor at Stanford, there was a colleague of mine, very senior, very respected. His name was Bruce Bueno de Mesquita. And he was the opposite of me. He was a quant guy. And he actually said, I swear to God he said this, he said, I do not believe that you should learn the language of the country you are studying because it creates bias. Because you get too close to your topic. I think that's insane, right? I mean, I don't like the fact that if you study Russia, most people that are Russian experts in the US have Russian background. They're emigres. So they either love Putin or they hate Putin. That is a problem. You know how we get around that? We have a very interesting way of getting around that at your age group. We have hedge fund clients. No, that matters. It matters because hedge fund clients don't care about what's going to happen in 5 years. They care about what's going to happen tomorrow, right? And that means that if you talk to a hedge fund about your analysis of where we are today, they're going to find out whether you're right or not very soon. Nothing makes you more honest as an analyst about your biases as finding out if you're wrong soon. You talk to ExxonMobil, they ask, oh, we're interested in 5-year, 10-year horizon. By the time you get there, they don't remember what you said, right? So I think those are some tools that allow you to become analytically more rigorous. There's one other thing that we do that's important, which is I'm a young guy. I'm 43. I started the company, I was 28. I didn't start the company like Kissinger, where I was already a big deal and everyone's like, oh, Kissinger, wonderful guy, he's a god, everything is right. I don't sit in a big office in my company. We all sit on the floor, right, with desks like Bloomberg, and everyone beats on each other. If somebody thinks I'm wrong, they say I'm wrong. You know, I mean, ultimately, the analyst that knows them, I mean, if I do US macro, that's what I read. So, I mean, if people want to disagree with me on the G0, they can disagree, but ultimately, it's my call. If I disagree with my Nigeria analyst about what's happening on the ground there with Boko Haram, we can disagree, but ultimately, it's his call. Why? Because he spends full time doing Nigeria. I may be his boss, doesn't matter. You have to have a flat structure. You have to have a structure where people are really given the ability to criticize you. And you know, my firm is that way. Nobody gets into trouble for saying Ian's wrong. And I think, you know, you have to create a culture where you actually really get benefited by doing that. I think if you put all that stuff together, you can do an okay job.
That's good.
Yeah.
In case of Globis, I don't have an office either. I'm sitting on the flat floor, and so that anybody can come in, and we have lively discussion, because I started when I was 29 as well. And,
Oh, that's old.
1 year older than you
1
were.
year older, that's right.
Why did you leave, you know, by the way, academic field and became more independent?
Because I was 24 when I got my PhD. Nobody should teach at 24. I didn't know anything. They've had me teaching students. I was a fraud. I was entertaining, but I was not useful. I had no experience. I had no real world experience. I was talking book knowledge, right? It's not a good thing to do. I didn't want to be a professor. And my advisor, Bob Conquest, the great Robert Conquest, says that we're going to make you a national fellow at the Hoover Institution. I'm like, I don't want to do this. I said, no. He calls my mother. Called my mother. And he said, this guy's crazy. We're going to make him a professor. He's saying no, he doesn't want to do it. Because I wanted to get real world experience. So my mother and all my friends all said, you've got to do this. This is a great opportunity. So I did it. I did for 2 years. Because you can't quit after 1 year. That's like you're quitting. And so you can't do that. And I hated it. And it's because it was so quiet. I was with all of these eminent old people. They wanted me to write things that no one would read, specialized stuff. It's not for me. But, you know, I finished my PhD in political science, and you know, when you do a PhD in political science, you either go into government or policy, or you go into academics or research. And it was clear to me that politics were mattering more to the marketplace for all the reasons that we talked about earlier. So I wanted to go get a job like in a bank or just to learn about the markets. I didn't want to do my career there, but just to learn how companies worked, how markets worked. And all of my colleagues said, well, no, you got a PhD in political science. They don't hire people like you. I said, no, you're wrong. So I came to New York, and I met all of these bankers and folks at companies, and they took me to these lunches. And I told them what I did now. It was very interesting. Bob Hormats, who's undersecretary now, but he was at Goldman Sachs back then. Teddy Roosevelt IV at Lehman Brothers. Frank Wisner at AIG. And they all took me for lunch. I got to know the waiters' names at Four Seasons very well. And I said I wanted to get a job, and they said, well, we don't really have, we don't hire political scientists. We just don't have jobs for people like you. But they kept taking me for lunch, so they clearly liked me, but they wouldn't hire me. So I'm getting very frustrated. So after a year, I did not intend to start a company. I didn't. I'm not a businessman. After a year, I finally went, and I should know who it was. I should know who my first client was. I don't actually remember. But I went to one of them, and I said, I was really frustrated. I said, look, if I put out a shingle, if I hung out a shingle, in other words, if I started a company, I don't know exactly what it would do. But like you like talking to me. If you're not going to hire me, would you at least become a client? And he said, sure. I was like, wow. And within 2 weeks, I had like 15 clients. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't have a business plan. I didn't have a model. But they helped me. They helped me figure out what the business plan was. And that's how I started the company. I mean, it was really a weird thing because there was never a political science company before. Right? I mean, there wasn't a political, we're a political science company. Right? I mean, all these poor bastards, they get degrees in political science, and then they can't actually become political scientists in the private sector. And now we can hire these people. I mean, right, it's kind of fun to be a political scientist in the private sector. So that's the story of how it started. I've never actually, I don't think I've ever said that in Japan before, but that's the story of how it started.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you started in New York, and which one was your next office outside of New York?
It was Washington.
Washington, and
Yeah,
then?
and then London.
And London, and
Yeah.
then?
Well, those are our 3 offices.
Oh,
And
I see.
the locals, we don't have offices for locals. The
Okay.
locals, we just hire about 150 are under regular contract. The rest are stringers. But, you know, offices are expensive.
Okay.
So, I mean, we have them work out of their
Well,
place of residence.
you
yeah.
have one in Tokyo.
Well, we have 3 people in Tokyo,
Three
but
people
yeah,
in Tokyo.
but we don't have a big office in
Oh,
Tokyo.
I see.
Yeah.
So as an entrepreneur yourself,
Yeah.
what was the toughest things that you had encountered during the process of building a company?
Oh,
Well, what was the most difficult part?
I would say there were 2 things. There were 2 things. The most difficult early thing was that I had no idea what I was doing as a businessman,
Okay.
right? I mean, I don't think of myself as a businessman.
Okay.
And if you have never started a company before, and if the people you hire have never done companies before, then you do stupid things. So you make tax mistakes, and right, you make mistakes. And like I was using Microsoft Word to run our accounts, adding the balance sheet on a calculator for the first 18 months, right? I mean, that was stupid.
It was 18 months.
Yeah.
Wow, that's long.
And then I went to Excel, and it was great. the more challenging thing was when we got to about 30 employees, I was managing all of these people. And it got to the point where there were, if you look back, if I had a resume, I don't have one, if I kept an academic resume, you would see about 4 years of my life where I didn't write because I was so busy running the company.
Sure.
And I was losing my expertise. I would sometimes go in front of clients, and I always prided myself on staying on top of all of this stuff. And I was so busy managing all of these people that it was, so I thought for about 6 months about downsizing the company so I could do what I wanted. Then I got lucky. I finally found a couple people that had some expertise. They weren't great, but they were actually just to run the company. And then it got easier. And now I don't run the company. I mean, I don't spend my time inside the firm managing anyone. I spend my time understanding what's happening in the world and trying to be the external face of the firm and building it, right? But I mean, you know, that was the hardest thing, was getting over that hump, because I wasn't enjoying it. I mean, when I say I'm not a businessman, if you took away Eurasia Group from me, I wouldn't start another company. I'm not a serial entrepreneur. It was hard. And I did it because I really wanted to be a global political scientist. I didn't do it because I wanted to start a company. It was really hard. I wouldn't want to do it again.
Okay, let's have questions from female participants or non-Japanese participants. Okay, yes. Yeah.
Non-Japanese female participants, that would be really exciting. We could just everything you want to say.
Sorry, I got half of the demographics here. My name is Jerry Manabny. I'm a student here at Globus, MBA student. First of all, as a Canadian, thank you earlier for the description of the Canadian-US relationship. I appreciate that. But you mentioned the inherent difficulty of things like climate change in a G0 world. How then do we tackle truly global issues like climate change with kind of a leaderless world without global summits?
But we
on
wait
climate
until there's a
change?
bigger crisis. We don't care enough, right? I mean, ask the Maldives. Going to lose them. We don't care. And we should. We don't. Now they're interesting. Now, Bjorn Lomborg, who believes that climate change is happening, but he also says that the technology is not very advanced. If we wanted to do something about it now, it would cost so much. We should wait until the technology is better, and then we can actually do it more effectively. That is I understand the argument, but it also is a depressing one because it means things get out of control. Look, it's very clear that, I mean, you look at the projections, and this is going to hurt a lot of people, but it's going to hurt a lot of poor people who we don't care much about. Reality. What do we do? What do we do? Right now, we're still focused on mitigation. Increasingly, we will focus on adaptation, and when that doesn't work, we will focus on geoengineering. Because the problem with climate change is smaller groups of countries don't really cut it. I mean, the US could get together with the entire developed world and say, we're really going to cut our emissions. And if China doesn't get on the program, it ain't happening, right? Well, nobody's going to force China to, because China looks at us and says, well, you guys industrialize. We want to industrialize. And then we say, well, wait a second. You got 1.3 billion people. You can't have the same level of industrialization that we have. Why not? Well, because you're too big. Well, they don't like that argument, right? And let's face it, the Americans would never tolerate the level of smog that you presently have in Beijing. In Beijing, they don't like it, but they've got a much higher tolerance. Why? Because they're making money. They're getting at that stage. It is thoroughly emotionally unsatisfying to say we need a bigger crisis. But analytically, it's very satisfying.
Okay, okay. And any other, okay, let's go.
Hi, Giles Murray from Fortune magazine. My question is quite micro and possibly quite naive. Last week I was speaking to a female Japanese teacher, and among her language students, she had some Chinese, young Chinese, and she was telling me that when they came to Japan, they were quite amazed at how friendly the Japanese people were, because they'd been brought up to assume basically that Japanese people were kind of ravening dogs of war. And I just wondered, do you think that popular attitudes like that, which are inculcated by the government, and these kind of just basically racial prejudices, whether it's Japanese looking down on Chinese or Chinese having a misperception of the Japanese, do you think these things matter?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think you look at Southeast Asia, and these are countries where the Chinese are dominant in the economic environment. And as a consequence, the Chinese feel more comfortable in Beijing, but they also have a lot of information. They know what's happening on the ground. There aren't that many Chinese in Japan. And that creates more mistrust. America is much more welcoming of immigrants. And the Chinese all send kids to universities in the US, and that helps actually create a better understanding among many Chinese of the United States. Americans don't travel as much. That's bad for the US. In the United States, you've got a whole bunch of people that are much more insular and much more willing to take on Tea Party type views, for example, because they've never been anywhere, right? America's a big country. Most Americans don't have passports. America needs to force its folks to care more about international affairs. They need more exchange programs. They need more foreign language programs. They need more cultural immersion. We don't do this well. The Japanese do this even worse than we do, right? Japan is very homogeneous. That's a great advantage for Japan in terms of its resilience with things like Fukushima, much better than the US and Katrina. But it's very bad for Japan when it comes out with things like trying to understand the Chinese.
Let's have a question from female participant from Southeast Asia.
Yes, hi. I'm a global student, and I'm from Indonesia.
Cool.
Yeah. So I actually have two questions. So one is, I think now I think everybody knows Indonesia has to play its cards right, because
Has to what?
play its cards right.
Yeah.
Because right now it's everyone's saying that it's the engine of growth for Southeast Asia. So vis-a-vis Indonesia's relationship with Japan, South Korea, India, and China, because it seems that Japan is not as aggressive as India, China, and South Korea in investing into Indonesia. And secondly, after Obama, what do you think would be the relationship between the US and Indonesia? Because right now, Obama has personal relationship, right? Having grown up in Indonesia.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are my two questions.
Look, I think it helped that Obama had that relationship with Indonesia. I mean, it also helped when Wolfowitz was running the World Bank because he had been ambassador to Indonesia and he was loved there. Of course, the U.S. response to the tsunami also helped a lot with Indonesia. I mean, they have been. Look, it's interesting. I don't know if you know this, being from Indonesia, but an interesting statistic for you. The American embassy in Indonesia has more internet visitors than any other U.S. embassy in the world. Interesting. You didn't know that. Interesting fact. The Americans are popular there. And it helps the relationship. I mean, it's certainly great that the folks in Indonesia thought they wanted to even put a statue of Obama in a park. I mean, that's great. But I think the relationship between the two countries is good. I think that, and clearly SBY the president has his orientation towards democracy, which is helpful. But I mean, even if Bakri were to come in, I think that you would still have a very strong desire to work with U.S. business, a very strong desire to work with the Americans. I don't think that's going away. So I actually feel okay about the Indonesia-U.S. relationship. I also think that there are a lot of Chinese living in Indonesia, but unlike Chinese living in Malaysia, right? The Chinese living in Indonesia, a lot of them intermarry. A lot of them take on Indonesian names. They're more insular. They're very connected to Indonesia as a country, and that helps to make Indonesia more international and in a balanced way, as opposed to we're just going to be in the pocket of the Chinese. You're right that the Japanese are not super aggressive in Indonesia, but I see Japanese corporations ramping up in Indonesia in a big way in the last few years. Our clients are much more interested, certainly on the extractive side, but also in other sectors, in retail. The Japanese are more interested. I mean, India and Indonesia are kind of two obvious places where when you have problems with China, you remember the China plus one strategy that the Japanese government's been talking about for a long time, Medi Jetro and the rest. Indonesia is obvious. So I think Indonesia is well positioned, but I also think that Japan will do okay there.
I used to work for Sumitomo Corporation. The presidents of Sumitomo Corporation always used to come from the presidents of Sumitomo Indonesia. And there was a strong tie between Japan
That's
and the
interesting.
Sumitomo
That's interesting.
Indonesia. Okay, let's have other questions. 1 and 2, and that will be the end of the time. Okay.
Thank you very much for a very impressive lecture. My name is H. Ishii from Mitsui and Company, and I'm very anxious to read your weekly report, Easy Upgrade, every week. Thank you very much. And I'd like to ask about two things, Japan and Syria. You already mentioned about how to, every beginning of year, you have mentioned about 10 geopolitical risks, and very regret to say Japan is a number 5 in this year. You mentioned about also Britain and Israel and Japan.
Right.
And could you mention, could you advise a little bit more about, say, Japan is not mentioned about next year's 10 geopolitical risk. And the point two is, number 2 question is about Syria. This week's Economics magazines cover stories about Syria, as you know. And I'd like to know your thoughts about how to, is any way of solving the Syria's current situation.
So we never talk about what the next year's risks are going to be till we put them out, as I'm sure you know. But you know, clearly you've got 70% approval ratings for Abe. You've got support for the TPP. You have more interest in foreign policy. You have the desire to create a national security council. You have a desire to have a close relationship with the U.S. You have, as you heard from Hori-san, you've got the India outreach. You've got South Korea outreach. These are the kinds of things you need to do to reduce the downside risk if you are Japan. Now, I feel fairly confident that if I come back next year, Abe will not have a 70% approval rating, because this is not Venezuela. Right? But it's a good start compared to other developed countries right now, and that's a promising thing. It's nice to see a leader in Japan that can last for a little while. It doesn't have to be Abe; it could be anybody, but just have someone that's going to stay, and that matters too. We'll see how upper house elections go in July. So that's Japan. Syria. So you probably know that Secretary Kerry is in the region, and he's about to engage in a long swing across Turkey and Egypt and the Gulf states. He's more concerned about Syria right now than Iran. I think that is appropriate. Syria is falling apart. America's policy on Syria so far has been blame the Russians. You know, it's really funny. I mean, I can just imagine a situation where Putin said, you know, I want to be nice. I know I've been hard on Syria, so I'm gonna support whatever you want to do. So this is I get questions like this on the environment, right? On North Korea. I resist when people tell me something has to be done, right? Failure is an option, right? Let's embrace that, right? It is irresponsible and unethical to not understand that failure is an option and not plan for that, right? People have been saying something has to be done for over a year and a half in Syria now. Something is not being done. The Obama administration came out and they said that if the Syrian government uses chemical weapons on their people, that is a red line. So apparently, if you don't use chemical weapons to kill your people, that is okay. I know that's not what Obama meant to say, but that is the message that is taken. And this is not the U.S. to blame. No one else wants to do anything either. No one else outside the region. In the region, countries want to do something, but they want to do different things. It's going to cause more fighting. It is getting worse, and as it gets worse, there will be more pressure to take action. And the war is expanding. It's not just 70,000 or 50,000 or 60,000. The numbers depend on who you listen to, but it's a lot of Syrians dead. But we also have about 800,000 refugees, and it is destabilizing Iraq. It's destabilizing Jordan. It's destabilizing Lebanon, and it's causing economic problems for Turkey. You know, this can continue. This is a civil war. It's a disaster. But I do not yet see the Americans coming up with a plan. I mean, Hillary Clinton tried to help put together an opposition government. It fell apart. Kerry has had some success. The opposition said they weren't going to meet. Now they say they are. Give Kerry a shot. It's going to be hard. The Russians are not on board, and the Russians matter. Libya is a good example of the G0, right? The reason that you got Libya done was because everyone hated Gaddafi. The Iranians and the Saudis both hated Gaddafi. The Iranians and Saudis agree on nothing in the world except for their hatred of Gaddafi. And then even then, the Americans didn't want to go in. And then the French and the Brits said, you got to do something. And finally, the Americans said, okay, but very limited. This is a G0 response. Syria is not Libya. Syria has support from Iran. Syria is close to Hezbollah. Syria has support from Russia, real support from Russia. Furthermore, it's not just Gaddafi with a bunch of African mercenaries. Bashar Assad, the military is driving him at least as much as he's driving the military. There haven't been that many defectors. And it's a sectarian fight between the Sunni and the Shia. This is not easy. I was with the British ambassador to the US just a couple weeks ago, and he doesn't see any short-term policy options. This is going to be ugly for a long time. I would not be shocked. I was on, I don't know if you guys watch Fareed Zakaria at all on the weekends. I like Fareed a lot. I was on his Look Ahead show, the beginning of the year, with Richard Haas, who runs the Council on Foreign Relations, Anne-Marie Slaughter, who was a great American policymaker. And he was asking about Syria and what we thought, and they were both saying something has to be done. And I said, you know, again, I don't have a crystal ball, but if you told me in January 2014 that Bashar Assad was still there, or the military was still there, I would not be shocked by that. I would be saddened by that, but I would not be shocked by that.
Last question. Okay, one.
Thank you. I'm Tomo Keizai Doyukai. The question back to the subject of United States and China. I'm interested in listening to what's your view on the military technology advantage of the United States over China. The military technology means not the number of budget, number of troops, but military technology like guiding missiles or the surveillance from the lot of satellites. And I just wondering, I think you know there's some real qualitative facts. Perhaps you listen to many military professionals, and I'm really wondering, you know, that China is catching up budgetary and many things, but I still believe the United States' advantage of those technologies are far advanced, but whether you see it's catching up, whether China is catching up and one day surpasses US technology on purely military side.
I wouldn't predict it in the foreseeable future. I mean, you look at aircraft carriers, and they got one. They repurposed it from the Soviet Union. It was going to be a casino, and they made it into a real aircraft carrier. It's not impressive. Their advanced fighters are nothing close to where the Americans are. When I talk to people in the Defense Department, they are worried about asymmetrical capacity of China to eventually force the Americans out of Taiwan Straits and to expand China's operating area in East and Southeast Asia, but not to pose a challenge to the US anywhere else around the world. Having said that, the Americans have been surprised by how quickly the Chinese were able to develop their stealth fighters recently. And there have been a number of developments that the Chinese have been able to reverse engineer from stealing American technology that clearly have happened more quickly than the American defense planners would have expected. So I'd be a little bit cautious, but I still think from the conversations I have with these guys presently that we're far from having to worry seriously about that. We're worried much more on the cyber side, and we're worried much more on the economic side, but increasingly the fights that you will have a greater economic component. You know, I think that the vulnerability, the internet was not created for security. The internet was created for ease of facilitating the transfer of data and information. And if you think about America's exchanges, the New York Stock Exchange, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, they're not created to stop a concerted effort to manipulate information by a well-funded government that intends to do so. You know, I would worry about the capacity of the Chinese, if they wanted to gain sensitive pricing information and manipulate American markets through cyber attacks. I would worry about that. I know that the American exchanges are worried about that. I am much more worried about the cyber attacks that American companies are not aware of than I am about the cyber attacks they are aware of, right? I mean, you know, Coca-Cola was trying to buy this Chinese orange juice company. It would have been a couple $2 billion deal, very, very large deal. We found out 2 years later that the reason it didn't work is because sensitive information on the deal was stolen by the Chinese competitor and was given to the Chinese government, and they stopped the deal, despite the fact that Coca-Cola has amazing relations with the Chinese government. Mukhtar Kent was personally guaranteed by the foreign minister who was going to go through, CEO. That's a big deal, right? Now, if we had learned about that when it happened, that would have had an enormous impact on the U.S.-China relationship. But we only found out 2 years later, so it wasn't a big deal. It's like, oh, yeah, okay, whatever, right? We're going to start learning about this stuff real time. So this is serious. And I say this because I worry about this more than I worry about the military stuff. Timing matters. People ask me about, you know, China's demographic crisis. I know it's a problem, but that's a later problem. We have problems that are going to hit sooner, and those are the ones we have to pay more attention to. Yeah.
Thank you, Ian. We had a very lively discussion. We did not talk much about Europe. You know, like in this year Davos, I feel very optimistic feelings in the air, and especially Davos is situated in Europe, and it seems like Europe problems seem to be somewhat stabilized. But do you think the election in Italy is going to have a major impact on the euro situation, or what do you think?
Short term, it has had a major impact. The Italian stocks are way off. I saw the banks off, you know, 5 to 10% in one day. But look, I will tell you, I was quite surprised by how well Beppe Grillo did. This kind of
5 stars, right?
5-star movement. And he's not a serious character at all. But there is Mario Monti did not take the elections as seriously as he should, was not respectful of the Italian constituencies. I think that's also true for Bersani on the center left. But now they will take him seriously, which means they will put a government together, because if they don't form a government and they have another election, Grillo might do even better. Now that government won't last very long, and it won't govern effectively. But Italy is not Spain. Italy's not Greece. They actually are running a surplus. And Italy does have a real economy. So I don't think, this is not a reversion to European crisis. The problem in Europe is because they're more optimistic at Davos, because people know that Europe isn't going to fall apart, the market pressure isn't there. And without the market pressure, these countries are no longer engaging in the proactive reforms to continue to consolidate the Eurozone that they need to. And also the Germans have elections that's slowing them down. So the crisis is not a disaster, but it's not getting fixed fast enough. Yeah.
Ian, thank you very much. I think I have learned as much as I wanted in just 2 hours, and I think all the audience here share that kind of thankful feelings towards you. And I think we talked about U.S., China, Korea, North Korea, and also some BRICS and Africa, India and Southeast, and also Middle East and Europe as well. And we have covered the whole world. And thank you, Ian, for taking your time to come over here. And please join me in thanking Ian for his great speech. Thank you very much, Ian.